Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams. Daniel, good to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Well, in the news, we have a story about the IMF. A close associate, friends that I have at the IMF. I've said only good things about the IMF, obviously being very facetious, but the director of the IMF, Christine Lagarde, is sort of under the gun from some things she did as financial director when she was still just representing France. But now that she's been the director of the IMF, there's a lot of failures and a lot of shenanigans going on, and some people are calling for her to leave the IMF. So what seems to be the problem? Why are people now ganging up on our side to get rid of Lagarde?
Well, it's interesting, and one of the things that fascinates me about this case is I think it's a huge case, but the mainstream media, except for a few exceptions, Ambrose Evan Pritchard being one, who's a very good financial journalist, are ignoring it. And this is the IMF's own independent evaluation office took a look at the IMF's handling of the Greek crisis and the bailouts at Greece and Portugal, and then they found that the IMF was absolutely lacking in transparency, completely disregarding the rules of the IMF. For example, they should have agreed. They forced austerity on Greece. By IMF rules, they should have also demanded a haircut. They should have demanded some debt relief. But for political reasons, i.e., to help the big banks, she disregarded that part on her own and simply put it all on the backs of the Greek citizens.
That seems to be the case. That was certainly the case on the bailouts in 08 and 09 when our Federal Reserve and all these international organizations were involved. That we've been talking about this for a long time, that they always bail out the special interest. But I think you touched on the most important thing, no transparency. And I mean, that's the whole thing that we argue against the Federal Reserve, and that's why we want an audit, to at least find out what they're doing. But it was designed that way. I mean, I don't think they just drift over to this. I think that it's been that way from the very beginning. So, but people do suffer from this, and it's very, very powerful. And I'm convinced also that these institutions like the IMF are not completely separate from international foreign policy as well as our foreign policy, along with European foreign policy when we start talking about what we're going to do around the world. Once they talk about freezing assets and putting on sanctions, the IMF is always involved in this. So it is an arm of the interventionist foreign policy, or vice versa, or they are all work together. And I think that's why this is a big issue. I just sort of hope that it stays in the forefront and people hear about it, because maybe there will be enough pressure put on her to resign or get kicked out or something. That's not going to be the solution. But keeping it in the news, I think, is important.
There was not long ago so much attention to the 1% versus the 99%. I think with this case, makes it so absolutely clear that the IMF does the bidding of the 1%. And Lagarde's background was no secret. She's actually being forced to stand trial for some actions that she committed when she was France's foreign minister in 2008. She approved 400 million euros in taxpayer dollars to go to an investor who had lost some money because supposedly Credit Lyonnais undervalued the value of his investment. It's a complicated thing, but when it came to a crisis, she took $400 million out of the French taxpayer and handed it to one of her buddies. And she's facing a trial. It should be a pretty big, scandalous trial, wasting €500 million. But guess what the penalty is going to be for her if she's convicted?
I bet it's going to be tough.
Maximum 1 year and $15,000 fine.
Not a bad investment, is it?
For $400 million.
The way this was set up really protects them from where are they going to get the money to do this? How did they manage their fund? But they're able to create money too, not at the rate they would like to, but the special drawing rights is something that was designed in 1944 with the Bretton Woods Agreement. And they can issue these, and this is paper gold. And some people wanted to make it the reserve currency of the world. They still would like to, but they can still create SDRs, and people can benefit from this. So they have financing. Of course, at times they go back to each country. But what if they come to us for an increase of funding of the IMF? There may be a little opposition to it, but so don't disrupt the international finances. But even if we did literally send some funds, where does our government get it? They get it from the Federal Reserve creating money out of thin air. So it's all a game they play.
Yeah, and they say that, if you talk about the IMF and global control of things, it sounds like some kind of conspiracy theorist. But here it is. It's laid out in black and white that the IMF exists to serve the elite. There's no accountability to the people. We can't vote out the IMF. Nobody cares what we think about the IMF. We have absolutely no control over it whatsoever.
Well, when I think about the IMF, I think of what George Bush said when they brought in the WTO. He says, this is the third leg of the New World Order. First, we have the World Bank and the IMF, and now the World Trade, the WTO. And it's globalism is what we're talking about. We know a lot about our problems here at home and the shenanigans go on and what they do in secret. But there's a worldwide globalist movement that's even more difficult to understand and more difficult to get the average American to even get interested in. But there's a healthy skepticism building and growing. I don't think I ever got into trouble by bringing up globalism in this negative sense and the controls by the United Nations and going to war without declaration and NATO and these things. So I think there's some friends out there that are sick and tired of all this. But the more information we can get out, the better.
And this is not conspiracy theory. You just look at the numbers. It's conspiracy fact. This is what happened. Lagarde threw aside the rules of the IMF because she wanted to protect the political enterprise called the European Union. She wanted to protect German banks, which were the financial core of the European Union. That's who she served, and it's completely out there in black and white.
Right. And the IMF was established at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in 1944, and it was a big deal. The war wasn't completely over, but they knew it was going to be over, so they were lying. They were conspiring to what they were going to do with the monetary order. We were the wealthiest. We were the least injured by the war. We held the most gold, so we were key to it. And in theory, we could dictate to them on our terms. But there was one person that, as far as I'm concerned, was probably one of the greatest financial writers of the 20th century, and that was Henry Hazlitt, who befriended Mises when Mises came over here and escaped the Nazis. But he was right on this. I think he refused to go. Immediately said this was bad news and we shouldn't be involved in this. And yet they totally ignore him. They pushed him aside. But he was absolutely right on warning about this. But the people went ahead, and of course our government went ahead and did the same. Went along with this conspiracy. One of these conspiracies that's a true conspiracy.
But you were saying earlier, some of the things that he wrote were so prescient at the time, in the 40s, that he wrote about the IMF.
Yeah, he was writing back then and said that it would be, massive inflation would destroy the dollar. He probably would have predicted that the dollar system would have ended. He sort of predicted 1971. He knew Bretton Woods wouldn't last, but my guess would have been that he'd have been surprised that they held the dollar standard together for so long, but it just built this much bigger bubble. But even back then, it was known that our key negotiator wasn't exactly an honorable citizen. And the person that we had doing all our negotiations was Harry Dexter White. And even as early as 1945, it was well known that he was a Russian spy. But he was our negotiator. He eventually became, director of the IMF, and then they wondered about it. But people in the Birch Society and a few other organizations, would mention this, and they were totally blasted for being conspiratorial and all this. But it turns out that this is factual history now, and then you wonder why we end up with such a mess. But Keynes, I don't think he was accused of being a Russian spy, but he was, believe it or not, Lord Keynes was a Keynesian. And I want to read a quote that he had, because during this debate on the IMF in 1944, he went before the House of Lords to give them an update on exactly what he was going on, I guess to reassure the British. But Keynes urged Britain to adopt the plan precisely because he regarded it as inflationist. It would provide, he argued in the House of Lords, and he went on to say, we intend to retain control of our domestic rate of interest. Well, that sounds okay. So that we can keep it as low as it suits our purpose without interference from the ebb and flow of international capital movements or flight of hot money. If I have any authority to pronounce on what is and what is not the essence of a gold standard, I should say that this plan is the exact opposite of it. And of course, that's the opposite of the market. He doesn't want interest rates to be controlled by the ebb and flow of capital, but that's the way the gold standard works. So it was an attack on the gold standard. Even at that time, Americans weren't allowed to own gold, and they could do a paper standard, and they would build it around the dollar. He saw the shortcomings of it. It was structured, to continue inflation at an international scale. Keynes had a very deep intent of using SDRs as the reserve currency. There's still a desire to do that, but I don't happen to believe the SDR is called a special drawing right, but it's a paper currency that the IMF uses just for on the books. So their desire, why do they want to inflate money? It's power and control. And is it our government against some other one? No, it's usually a conspiracy of certain countries, like the current case we're talking about here and now in the bailout, the Greece bailout, where they punished the people. Who did they protect? It was the French banks and the German banks. Yeah. And but there was a bailout, but there was a cost that they had to pass on, and somebody always has to suffer. But look at who suffered here in this country in the last 8 years. It's been the middle class. And this is, of course, what Mises predicted, that this whole idea of manipulation of currency and the destruction of currency affects the middle class more than anybody else. At least on the short run, the people in a good position, the big banks and the big corporations, they seem to do quite well. And the one thing that is not talked about very much, but I think it should get more attention, is something I've mentioned before, and that is the combination of finances and also foreign policy, because they can do a lot behind the scenes and prop up governments that seem to be just horribly evil governments, and we do and have done business with them, but the finances can be more secret, and they can help them out with these loans, and I think they can help, they obviously help out to prop up the stock market. If our plunge protection team wants to protect the stock market, they can easily work through these systems, shovel a little bit of currency over to these central banks and buy up some futures and manipulate markets. I really believe that happens.
It seems like such common sense. It doesn't seem like rocket science. And you drew the connection between foreign policy and this Keynesian economic policy. But it seems obvious, if interventionism works so well, then why is the world in such a disaster? If Keynesianism, if zero interest rates, if negative interest rates work so well, why isn't Japan having the strongest recovery in the history of the world? Why isn't Europe recovering and being a strong economic powerhouse?
If inflation is good, and that's one of the goals of our Fed right now, is push up price inflation, Zimbabwe should have done pretty well, and Venezuela should have done pretty well, because they were able to push up consumer prices. But no, they never stop and think about it. Mistakes they cannot handle, because, and this is why I don't think they'll ever change their mind. Even if they're a serious academic, they don't change their mind, because it might, take 30 or 40 years of their intellectual pursuits and say, I was on the wrong track and I was wrong. They can't do it psychologically. They can't accept it. It'll go back to sort of like in foreign policy. It's just the management. Intervention isn't the problem. It's we didn't keep the troops there long enough. We didn't have enough troops. We didn't have enough alliances with the wrong kind of people. It goes on and on. It's always the management, never the policy, and that's what we're suffering from today.
And that brings up the question that I wanted to ask you when we first decided on this topic, because it seems to me right now the pressure is not building on the IMF over this. And surprise, surprise, it should be a bigger scandal. But if the pressure does start building, if journalists start writing about it, people start asking questions, we know what's going to happen. It's not going to be, okay, let's get rid of this, it's corrupt. It's going to be calls for reform, you know. And I was going to ask you, what do you think reform would look like, and is that the way to go?
Well, isn't that good news? They're recognizing there's something wrong and they're going to have reform. Oh, another opportunity to bail out our friends and rearrange the chairs and work it out so special interests benefit. We should always be very, very cautious when they talk about reforms. The little bit of experience that we had in Washington, reforms was a warning sign. Reforms meant, yes, they may change things, but reform is supposed to be improve things, but it never improves things. It makes things worse. I think, as I mentioned about the beginning of the IMF, there were wise people who knew that it was wrong. I believe the word corruption is minor. If our key negotiator was a Russian spy, somebody should have suspected that there was something going on here. And it's not only is corrupting for special interests, but economic nonsense. You know, it doesn't make any sense. It defies history. It defies the notion that money has to have real value. I saw a report this morning on the internet which shows that people aren't buying bonds and people aren't buying stocks and they're not buying any paper assets. They don't want certainly government bonds, but they are buying hard assets. They're even, buying lands and buildings and production groups. But it was a move. They didn't say move to gold, but included it was a gold, but to the hard assets. I think that's a thing, a thing that is very significant. But what we need to do is not reform. I think we should copy our little program that we've had for a few years. I think it was called End the Fed. I think it's time. No reform. End the IMF. How would that be?
Sounds like a good idea.
I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. I hope you keep an eye on the IMF. I know most of you already know a lot about the IMF and you don't think well of it. There's nothing beneficial to the IMF. It installs a system of international money and globalism, which is giving us nothing but grief and is going to get a lot worse. So this revelation of the problems the IMF is facing is very good. It calls attention to it. But the biggest thing is the issue that Daniel brought up, and that is the issue of reform. Yeah, they're going to reform it. No, we need to get rid of it. We need the marketplace. We need a gold standard. We need liberty. And we need property rights. All the things that would cancel out all this, rather than just institutionalizing these organizations, which they do in total secrecy, no transparency. That's characteristics, whether it's the IMF or the or the Federal Reserve or the World Bank, no transparency whatsoever. So that is what we need, and believe me, there's going to be an opportunity because this is just another sign of things not working well. They're not working well at the IMF. There is a limit. You can't dump on the middle class forever. It's also one of the reasons why the middle class, whether it's in the United States or around the world, they're suffering, they're rebelling. Unfortunately, many of them are going to say, well, we need a strong leader that will give us stuff for free, and they don't understand economics, but they do know that they've been dumped on. But our job is to give them the economic and political message of why the middle class has been dumped on. It's easily explainable, and the solution, as far as I'm concerned, is not too difficult to understand. It's found in the cause of liberty. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.